technically these are not catacombs. By definition, are a burial site. Nobody was buried here when they died. They were moved here. These are carrières, or quarries. They are bone deposits. The reason we call them catacombs is pure marketing. And you can get your hand, scrape it up the wall, and end up with a tennis ball sized clump of human. Wow. The sign says, where is death? If you remember that it is always in front of you, it will soon be behind you. Once you accept that your time here is limited, you're actually much more free. In Latin, it says, Quacum ileris sequitur cor morto presumere. Whomever enters this place, death will follow like a shadow. So of course you will. All right, let's keep going, guys. But get yourself ready, because the first thing is obviously some sushi.
Bonjour monsieur. Open the bag please. It's okay. Please. Go back sir. Téléphone, keys, coins, wallet. Thank you. Bonjour. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. Bonjour.
Ça va? Ça va. All right, folks. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna make our way all the way downstairs. You're gonna make your way down. I have to be the last one, so you're gonna make your way down this spiral staircase. Once you get to the bottom, you'll see there's 3 small rooms. You're gonna go to the very last one and wait for me there. I'll be right behind you guys, but go to the last one, wait for me there. If you find yourself in a tunnel, turn around, you've gone too far. All right, so I'm gonna scan everybody in.
Catacombs.
Yes.
Just got here. Last event of the vacation, of the travel.
Careful with your head.
Yep.
Right here. Careful. Okay, so 1.
So 3 rooms.
Yes. 1, 2, 3.
Definitely, let's try to keep the doorway clear so people can pass through, and also the entrance right here and there. The oldest bones here are about 1,200 years old. Okay, but the story of this area actually goes back further, a few million years of history, actually, in a couple of minutes. So if we go back about 20 million years, more than a few. This area, all the way up to from Burgundy, all the way up to where Dover and its famous white cliffs are, there was actually an inland sea once the land rose, the sea receded. You had all of this sea life that rested on what was now the new surface. Okay, what does that create? If you're from Florida, we have a very similar thing: limestone. So now we have these tens of meters of limestone just hanging around this area, limestone and chalk, from Burgundy all the way up to southern England. Okay? Now, we're going to fast forward another 25 million years to the year 52 BC. And there is a general in Rome we all know of named Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, to kind of establish himself as the true leader of Rome, defies the Senate and invades an area known as Gaul, an area still today known as Gaul. France is still often called Gaul. Why does he do this? The Gauls are actually people Romans are terrified of. The Gauls managed to lay siege to Rome twice in the previous centuries. So these are people that they had never managed to conquer, and they were terrified of the Gauls. So what does Caesar do? Is I'm going to prove that I and only I can conquer these people, even though the Senate denied him the right to do that. He goes ahead and does it. So he crosses into Gaul, and bit by bit he defeats the Gauls. Now, the Gauls were not this unified people; they were largely separate tribes, but they did unify to try to defend themselves against the Romans. But too late. He finally beats them in something called the Battle of Alesia. He actually came very close to losing. If the Gaul general had a drone at his disposal, he actually would have won because he would have realized where his own reinforcements were. But anyway, Caesar wins in 52 BC and then starts making his way up that territory. And around 51 BC ends up in where we are now. So he follows a river we now call the Seine, and he came upon an island we now call Ile de la Cité, which is where Notre Dame is. There he finds a Celtic tribe, a Gaulish Celtic tribe. This tribe is called the Parisii. Now, they don't name Paris Paris at this point, but the Romans did as Romans do. They took over, and they created a proper Roman settlement. Does anyone know what the Romans called it? I said it wasn't Paris yet. What did the Romans call it? They called it?
With an L?
Yes, it is with an L. All right, it's Lutece or Lutetia. It actually just means mud city. Okay? Because the river, as rivers do, flooded regularly, and the entire area was just a muddy, marshy mess. Okay, the very fancy Marais neighborhood just means marsh. Okay, so they take over on eastern end of the island. They put in a temple to Jupiter. On the western end, they build the basilica. Now, basilica to us now is a religious building. At the time, it was a civic building. And think of it more like town hall or city hall. Okay. Then all this means that for 2,000 years there has been a religious building on that eastern end, because where that temple to Jupiter was is where Notre Dame is now. And there's been a civic building on the other side, because where that basilica was is where the Conciergerie, which was the royal palace, and where the Palace of Justice currently is at. For the first several hundred years, it was actually really easy to get to. They barely had to dig. Okay. Sort of the reverse of the low-hanging fruit. It was right very near the surface, and they could just create these temples and these basilica with that equipment, with that material. I'm going to skip over a very minor detail of history: the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire falls, and then what we have is these tribes that were somewhat aligned with Rome. They were actually mercenaries of Rome, called the Franks. The Franks are the ones that take over. The Frankish kingdom breaks up and unifies several times over the next few centuries, because how their dynasty worked is you would divide the kingdom equally amongst all the male children. But eventually they would either kill each other, or most of the brothers would die, and so it would get reunified under one. He'd have 3 sons, split again, unified, split again. The central kingdom, called Neustria, they chose Paris as their capital. So this is really where the Kingdom of France has its birth, in the 5th century. Again, because of that location on the river, and secondly because of what they started doing, something they still do to this day. They make their money from exchanging currency, from exchanging money. Just like they charge you all ridiculous commissions if you try to go change money now in Paris, they were doing the same thing back then. But when you tried to cross the river coming from the north, it's called the Pont au Change, the change bridge. For that's where you would get all the money changers in there. And this kingdom grew and grew and grew. The kingdom of Neustria, eventually the kingdom of Franks. In the 5th century, that kingdom becomes Christianized. Okay, and then the aristocracy and eventually the people themselves become Christian. This extends and extends, but they continue building because of all of these limestone here. Eventually, the easy stuff they run out of. By about the 10th century, they run out of the easily accessible limestone. Then they start digging shafts underground to start essentially mining all of that limestone. And that's why we have what we have now. Okay, so starting in about the 10th century, we start building quarries all around the city of Paris, not yet inside, but around what was then the city of Paris. And it's those rocks from here that build things like the Louvre, that build Notre Dame. All of those stones that you see now come from down here, from where we are. By the time that quarrying is done, we have about 300 kilometers worth of tunnels under the city of Paris, about 187 miles under the city of Paris. Big problem with that though. As the city starts growing, starts expanding, there starts to be issues with the foundations all around. A lot of those 300 kilometers were not done with the knowledge and certainly not with the authorization of the state. In many cases, we didn't know where those tunnels were until something that happened here in the late 18th century occurs. Where we're standing at now, just above us, there was a building that collapsed and collapsed into this crater where we are now. And that started happening all around the city. Because until the 18th century, this was outside the city of Paris. Did you all see that outside, that lion that was out there? Okay, that's called the Lion of D'Enfer. That lion used to represent where the wall was separating Paris and outside Paris, the suburbs, essentially. Okay, all of this area, even though it was the oldest part of the Romans built, it was actually less densely populated than the northern part. But once they needed more room, they started expanding, they start creating all these buildings here, not knowing that the foundation under it is as weak and as Swiss cheese-like as it is. All right, so all of these things start collapsing. And we get several collapses per year by the time we get into the era of Louis XV and Louis XVI. So what Louis XVI eventually does, we remember what happens to him, right? In the 1790s. He orders the government to start reinforcing and mapping these tunnels, okay? So they start building even more. This is the point where we start to get to the 300 kilometers because they had to build more tunnels to reinforce, bring in material to reinforce the existing ones, and we get to that 300 kilometer figure, okay? And they start creating and reinforcing all of these quartiers, we call them quarries, under the city of Paris. One of you also asked me about how many catacombs there are in Paris. The reason I said 0 is related to this, okay? Technically, these are not catacombs. Catacombs, by definition, are a burial site. Nobody was buried here when they died. They were moved here after they had already been buried. We'll get into that story a little bit later. These are quartiers, or quarries. The area where we have the bones are ossuaries. They are bone deposits. Okay, the reason we call them catacombs is pure marketing. Everybody knew the catacombs of Rome, which are proper catacombs because those were the first sites of burials for those people who died there. So they decided to name these the catacombs of Paris. But technically, we don't have catacombs in Paris. We have ossuaries. Okay? So this first part of the tour is actually going to be the story of these quartiers, the story of these quarries, okay, and what they have to do with the city of Paris as a whole, and the city and how they shaped really the city that we see above us. Okay, and then the second half of the tour, we'll get to what you all really want to see, which is the boats. All right, we're gonna go down this tunnel there. I'll have to be the first one in this case. Now, generally, we're gonna try to stay in single file. There's gonna be a few places where I'm gonna stop. All right, we can stop here for a minute and hang out. I'll get on your right. Over on your right. Yep, just get right there. Okay, just on the right, one after the other, one after the other. On your right, that's pretty much kind of how we're gonna do a good bit of the tour. Now, as I said, this is about average for most of the tour, so if you're okay in this tunnel, you're gonna be okay for the rest of the tour, all right? Good? All right, I just wanna be in one line, that way we don't block and everybody can come through. Wanna show you guys this right here, if I can ask you to move. It says 5J 1847, okay? We're gonna see quite a few of these. This is actually one of the later ones, one of the younger ones. I'll explain to those in the back in a minute as well. So we'll take them backwards. 1847 was essentially the last reinforcement done to this wall. J is the initial of the chief engineer at the time, and 5 is the number of times they had to come in and reinforce it. So essentially they failed about 4 times before they had to come in, and finally they fixed it in 1847. Obviously there are modern inspections. It's not like 1847 was the last time this was inspected, but this is the old system. The numbers get a lot higher than 5. At the end of the tour, I'm gonna ask you all to see what the biggest number it is you saw on the way through here, okay? That's the first 10 of you or so to go up about 20 paces that way. And then those in the back.
20 paces. Is that 20 paces?
I guess so.
I don't know how long a pace is. Does anybody know how long a pace is?
That's probably 20.
I assume a step, but I don't know.
You see this black line above you all? It kind of comes in and out. You all see that? Yeah, any guesses about what that black line is? We can continue with me.
Guidance.
Good, yeah, that black line is guidance. So when they first opened up this place to visitors, so this would have been early 20th century, they didn't have lovely guides like myself. They just gave you a torch and told you, hey, follow that line. Most people made it out. All right, well, we'll do this because it's a little bit odd. I'm going to spiritual talk. I'll have a few of you come up there because we're going to face this guy here. So just stay there to make sure you can see up here, and then stay up against that wall here. Stop there. Okay, because we'll be looking back at this guy here. Okay? It's a bit odd down here. What we have is a street sign, right? And we have a few of them actually, and it says Avenue de Montsouris. Again, very pretty. It just means mouse mount. We have literally one rat for every person in the city of Paris. But it's a lovely park as well, by the way, Parc Montsouris. Why is this down here? Okay, so when they started doing all of the reinforcement work in the late 18th century, but really mostly in the 19th century, to kind of orient themselves and give themselves sort of a plan of attack, they started following the streets above. So that they know where they are, they put the street signs down here. So the Avenue de Montsouris would have been above us. In this case, the Avenue de Montsouris still is. What's really interesting, particularly for people like me, now my specialty in history is essentially medieval France, is that a lot of these streets that we have down here don't exist anymore. We've had so many revolutions in France and so many kind of building of Paris that a lot of these streets don't exist. So in many cases, the only evidence we have of them is down here. Okay, and the streets down here. I'll get to why later, but in the 1850s, 1860s, Paris was completely redone. And very little of what we see in Paris now dates back to anything before the 1850s. So much of the best information we have is actually what's down here. So we see a lot of these signs. And for many of them, like Rouvalet, stuff like that, it's only down here we have them. And as we go through, we're going to go on, again, single file on the right-hand side.
Hit my head already.
Just stop right here and just kind of back right against here.
Okay.
Okay. Alright, good. So, this is not one of the official spots, but I want to talk a little bit about physically these tunnels, okay? So I mentioned there are 300 kilometers worth nearly of these tunnels. They are largely concentrated in this southern part of the city. And they're actually on 4 different levels. Okay, we're going to be going on 2 different levels, and they're winding all around us. Just behind me, in front of you guys, about 3 meters in, is a whole other tunnel. Okay, but a couple of meters behind you is an entire other tunnel. When they were reinforcing these tunnels, but also when they were working here. So one of the most important things to really anybody working in tunnels like these, just like it is now, will be the question of air and ventilation, right? Okay. So one of the things they did is they took advantage of the density of these tunnels, and they actually built these really small, what they call aiguillages, or needles, essentially. They built these aiguillages, the needles are really just a small shaft that connect one tunnel to the other, and that allowed air to really circulate throughout the entire system. Okay? What I want to show you guys now, the reason we're stopped here is because it's actually my favorite of the aiguillage, even though it's not labeled. And I want to show you what these look like, and you can actually see straight into another tunnel that is still mostly filled up. It hasn't been dug back out. And so when you see here, once you see that, if you want to take a photo, and then go up about 20 paces that way, okay?
Oh, wow.
Okay. So that would be the still filled in remnants of another tunnel.
That's crazy. I don't know. What do you think, Sophie?
Crazy tunnels are short. Hit my head already.
Oh. I'm trying to guide you a little bit.
I just can't imagine being out here back when they built it.
I'm surprised this is limestone. I thought limestone was chalky and like easily to break. Shows how much. Maybe there's different types of limestone.
Thank you.
And just be careful, everyone, the floor is uneven, as you've noticed, and it can start to get slippery.
Watch out.
Alright, and we'll fill up this space in here. This one is actually for us. Alright. Okay, so what that says up there is chemin conduisant. It is chemin conduisant à l'escalier. Pretty simple, okay? The path leading you to the stairs. Modern translation, emergency exit. Alright? If there was an issue down here, those gates over there, those gates there, would lead you up. And where would it lead you to? It would lead you close to, no need for that to there, yep. It would lead you close to the aqueduct d'Arcueil. The aqueduct was a Roman era aqueduct built to service Paris with water. It's still there. If you take the RERB, you go under it. You see the arches. By the time you get here, it's actually just underground. Again, we're on a little bit of lava plateau in the southern part of the town. We are, though, in these catacombs. We are below the metro. We are below the sewers.
Below the
Sewers and below the metro. Okay? The metro in Paris is, except for a couple of lines, it's relatively shallow. What we did mostly is called cut and cover. We just dug into the street, put in the tube, covered it back out. Okay? So that's why the metro, that's where we can get actually a good 5 feet, 6 feet. So on the metro in most cases. We're 20 meters underground. And the space where you guys are now is what we term an atelier. An atelier is a French word for a studio or a workshop. Essentially, this is where the workers would have prepared the stones after they'd been cut to be brought up to the surface. Okay, they would have had a wheel on the surface that would have pulled them up. Okay, after they had been cut into these rectangular blocks. The atelier also, when we get to the boned parts, is most of those areas are actually ateliers that have been filled up, and it gives the illusion of one straight tunnel. Okay, but it's actually these ateliers like this that have been filled up. What these ateliers also are intersections of multiple tunnels. Okay, so you see behind that video screen, which is not very helpful, the placement of it, but you see the rocks behind it are quite different, right? Than the rocks all around it. That's because there's actually an entire tunnel going that way. That then ends here, and they've just covered that up. Okay, so these ateliers were just really the intersections of these tunnels and the areas where the workers would have finished up the shaping, the cutting of these blocks, more rectangular than block, before having them hoisted up to the surface. Okay, mining then, like now, was one of the world's most dangerous jobs. The health situation for the people down here was atrocious. Now, it's not a coal mine like we have in Tennessee quite a bit. I don't know if you're here for a few years from Tennessee. Yeah. So we don't have things like black lung, for example, but there is still a lot of fine particulate in the air, which would have made them very much prone to respiratory infections. There's also the issue, one of you asked me about the lighting here, okay? The lighting here happened at the same time as the electronic sort of ventilation system that come, 1956, all right? One of the issues, apparently, we have a lot of journals from doctors at the time and researchers, that a lot of the people down here were susceptible to vision issues, okay? Because they spent their entire days down here. in the very nearly unlit location. Okay, so a lot of them suffered from vision issues. Life expectancy, it's a weird stat by the way, life expectancy, I'll explain why later, was about 28, which I'm not working on.
And how early in their age would they start down here?
They would start down here typically after military service. So the plurality of people down here were actually old soldiers and old Marine people. So they would typically start, if they came out of the service, they would be about 21, 22, unless they were career officers, and if you were an officer, you weren't working down here. If they weren't, you could start here as early as 12 years old.
Was collapse an issue?
Collapse was absolutely an issue down here. Yeah, collapse was an issue down here, and we know we've lost many people here to the collapse. Yeah, purity of the air, and then over in long term, the dust and light. Those are long term things.
So life expectancy was 28. Was that in general? Or
No, that's generally people down here. Now, the weird thing about life expectancy, by the way, guys, I'm about to kind of discredit what I just said. Life expectancy is very odd, okay? Life expectancy is obviously just an average for an entire population. Generally speaking, even back then, if you made it past childhood, you were okay. Okay? What kept it low on the average was childhood mortality. Okay? Was the number of people who would die at birth and the number of people who would die as children. That's why the average is so low. But if you were able to make it to past childhood, you're actually generally okay. Same thing is now. So, you know, life expectancy is what, early 70s, I believe? But if you actually make it past 40, your life expectancy is 86. Because again, all those averages, they take things into account, accidents and things like that. So generally, if you make it past 40, you make it to about 86, 87. But it was the same thing back then. It's not like people were like dropping dead at 28. It's just that we're counting in all of that child mortality, all of the infant mortality, and that brings the average way down. Any questions, folks? Yeah. As I said, a couple of places you can still see what it was like before the Marais, and some places in the Latin Quarter. You can see the old cell. Also, quick tip, if you haven't been to Notre Dame yet, or in front of Notre Dame, or if you have, go again, on the courtyard in front of it, the Parvis, look down. There's actually the trace of the streets, how they were before the 1850s. Okay, and you have the little streets that go from the middle, the trace right in the middle, that was the widest road in all of Paris. So stand there and imagine that was the widest street. And then you can see the traces of, there were 8 churches just in that spot, okay? So the churches, you see all the names of the businesses are actually still there engraved. And you can see on the traces, just look down. We never look down, we never look up. Look down, you'll see the traces there, okay? And on your right, these were the spots, again, where there would be cracking and opening up the pieces of limestone. And one of the ways they would do it is they would perforate the limestone. They would put small pieces of wood within each perforation, and as the wood absorbed the water, it would expand, and it would slowly break that stone apart. We're going to take this little spot in here. Just remove and squeeze in there. Yeah, you're good, you're good. Squeeze in there. Squeeze in here, guys. Alright, cool. Alright, so because we're going to do now, and this is why it's really important that's only our group. See that gate there? Okay, that's closed to the general public, but it's going to open up for us in a couple of minutes, okay? So I'm going to need to designate someone who's going to be the last person to come down, because I have to go in first. Who's going to be the last one? Okay, you start. Thank you very much. All right. So I'm gonna go over and ask them to open this up for us. just because I like to keep good relations with them, when we come over here, let's just give him or her a nice bonjour. All right, you're gonna be the last one, okay? Donc le monsieur qui est le dernier, il savent que c'est lui le dernier. All right, folks, this way. All right, guys. All right, we'll start here. It's just us. We can stage structures 2 by 2. One of you asked me why is it closed. It actually, if you did this tour 10 years ago, and certainly when I first started doing it, this was not closed. It was open to everybody, but not everybody behaved themselves. So there are a couple of sections they closed off. This is one of the most interesting sections when it comes to really the life of those workers down here. Okay, I talked about the terrible working conditions, the health issues. It is still France, though, so they still had their breaks, right? And their breaks included some wine during lunch. And this section actually shows us what one of those workers spent about 5 years worth of breaks doing.
5 years?
5 years. Wow. It's fill that space, and want you to kind of take a look, take a photo, and then just kind of step back so that everybody else can do the same once you've done it.
Okay, do you want me to come this way?
Yeah, we can eventually go that way, just sort of that everybody can kind of take off.
Oh my gosh.
This was done by a man named Thomas Decure. Thomas Decure. I mentioned that the plurality of people here were French veterans. Thomas Decure was a member of the French Navy. After his service in the Navy, he found work down here. I mentioned how dangerous mining work is and was. Also, because of that danger, even back then, it was some of the best paid work you could do. That is Port Mahon, which is now a Spanish island. It's an island of Mallorca. Okay? And the French had a base there, and he was stationed there for 2 years. So when he came to France, back to Paris after his service, he worked down here and he started carving from memory what Port Philippe and Port Mahon looked like when he was there. Okay? And when he also wanted to do, if you see that what we're stepping on now, you see these blocks, okay? The sort of tile looking things here. Now he put those in as well. What he wanted to do was, the impression he wanted to give was that as you came in, this was essentially the sea, and you were approaching it as a boat coming up to the port. And then you would see in the distance the Port Mahon. All right? He wasn't just really artistic, he was a wonderful early capitalist as well, because his idea wasn't just that anybody could come in here. He was going to create his own entrance and then charge people some money to come down here and take a look at those. All right? Clever. Not quite so clever or intelligent, though. Because after 5 years of this, he started creating his entrance. By the way, only one other person knew he was doing this. He was not an engineer, though. Very good carving, probably a very good sailor, not a very good engineer. And he was building the entrance, didn't realize there was a tunnel right above him, and it collapsed onto him and killed him. Okay? Now, the one other person knew what he was doing, alerted sort of the former supervisors of the work site. They all came down here. I'll show you the spot where it was. And they found his body.
28 years.
No, he was a bit older. I believe, I'm not sure his exact age, to be fair, but I think he was a bit older. Now, part of the deal of working down here was a novelty at the time, which was that if you died when you were working down here, your widow would get a pension. It was very unusual at the time. The state tried to deny that pension. Same reason they would now, right? Nobody ever gave them the permit to come down here. But the other workers, not good enough, right? And so what did the workers do? They're French workers. What do French workers do when they're not happy? Strike. They went on strike, and eventually the state relented. They put up a plaque to his honor, which we'll see in a minute, and they provided that pension. All right? They're the ones charging you money now to come down here. So they've more than made up for that which they paid out, because this tour wasn't free, was it? They're the ones charging you, making all that money for that.
That black line you were talking about?
That is exactly. So you see, the regular route used to come down here, but it was in 2016, maybe 2015, that they shut this down for the general public. Going this way. Stand back here. And this is his second piece of art here. And kind of again, like I said, there's going to be a tiny squeeze, so just go a few steps that way once you see it. And then come back in. Huh?
Is this the same?
Same one, yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is the one he was actually working on when he died. Okay. First of all, cet ouvrage, so this work was started in 1777 by the Cure, known as Beau Séjour, that was his nickname, a veteran of His Majesty's, and was finished, or he was finished, in 1782. Now, we are grammar militants in France. It's like there's no better way to insult somebody than correcting their grammar in France, like seriously. And so this was one of the things here. You see after set, C-E-T, it's sort of scratched out. That's because sort of ouvrage is masculine, but they inadvertently put the feminine. There was a T and an E, and they could not possibly leave that there, so they had to scratch it off. So there was that space there between the set and the ouvrage. But the other reason this spot is, I think, very interesting, I talked about in the very first stop, the inspection and reinforcement. Obviously, inspection is ongoing, it doesn't stop. And here we see what that looks like now. You see this up here. There's another one right up there. Okay, and there's one over here. And so across these cracks, they put in these rulers. And then as that shifts or moves, they can keep track of how much that shifted. There hasn't been a major collapse here in a very long time. The last major collapse was all the way back when in 2004.
Let's not jinx it.
Yeah, let's not jinx it. I'll explain why that happened in just a minute. But those works, most of that work is actually done by the staff and the students of the most prestigious engineering school in France. It's called the École de Mines, literally the school of mines, the mining school. Okay, and throughout their 3 to 5 years, depending on what program they're doing, the students will come down here. So with professors and the assistant professors, they're the ones that go through these 300 kilometers and inspect and keep track of the safety down here. And because of that, there's a little ceremony when you graduate from that school that happens on our next little stop. Alright. And you would go, and you'll see, you go down those stairs, and we'll see it all around here. We're gonna line up. From here, just put this, careful with your phones and your cameras, guys. You can take photos of this.
Ooh, yeah.
Okay. And again, this is we'll do this in shifts. Okay. So what we're looking at now is it looks like a well. It was actually a hole that was dug for scientific purposes. It was dug to study the strata underneath. So the different geological layers underneath the city of Paris, and it filled up with water. This water, although it looks a bit dirty, is actually very clean. It gets filtered through 20 meters of limestone. It's very mineral, but it's quite clean. All right. And so the ceremony that happens here every year, every June, actually early July, sorry, for the École de Mines, is before you can officially graduate. You come into the space. You take those steps down. At the bottom, there is the equivalent of a dean, and you essentially get baptized in these waters, and then you're officially an engineer of the École de Mines. Wow. Okay, I've been lucky enough. One of the reasons I got to go to all these places where we weren't supposed to is because one of my first friends here was a young man from Switzerland who was a student at the École de Mines, and nobody knows these tunnels better than they do. So he was the one that would bring me down here.
This is crazy.
Yeah.
The structure and stuff that's been here for so long.
Actually, this is where oftentimes the parliament would walk up.
You?
Oh yeah.
And you got the front gets up where you want. Can you open? All right. I'm gonna kind of make a little half circle around me.
Okay.
I want to stop here because we are close to the real reason you all came over here, which are these bones. All right. So I want to put them in a little bit of context and talk about why they're here and why they're here the way they're here. All right. So I mentioned that the reinforcement of these tunnels started in the late 18th century. The 1770s was when this first started here. 1776, actually, an important year for most of us. Sorry, 1774, still an important year when it started. Paris had another problem going on at the same time. I said those bones were 1,200 years old, okay? Now let's go all the way back to Roman times. Have any of you been to Pompeii?
Yes.
Yeah. If you had a guide in Pompeii, they may have mentioned that there's something in Roman towns, it's called essentially designates the end of the city. It's not always a wall, but essentially it's a line that everybody knows that is outside, that is inside. Dead bodies were gotten rid of outside of the city. Whether it was cremation, whether it was burial towards the end of the empire, whatever it was, they knew to get rid of bodies outside of the populated centers. Now, they didn't understand germs and things the way we do now, but they knew it wasn't a good idea to just They brought those same traditions and ideas when they took over in 52 BC here in Gaul. By the time we get to the Christianization around 408 AD, 4 AD, sorry, Christians, particularly early Christians, and when I say early Christians at this time, I mean what we would only now call Catholics. If you're a Christian, if you're a Catholic, particularly at this time of history, where do you want your loved one buried? Cemetery. That cemetery is usually where? By a church. Okay. Even now, Catholic burial is on consecrated land. Not necessarily next to a church, but the cemetery itself, the Catholic cemetery, has been consecrated for burial. And typically, where was the church in relation to the rest of the city?
Center.
Right in the middle. Okay? So, there are a couple of reasons for that. If it was a town that already existed under the Roman Empire, what they had done is they converted their most important building, the civic building, the basilica, into a church. Yeah, that's what we call now. Many churches are now known as basilicas. Okay? But what also happened in the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance is you would have an important abbey, an important church, maybe a saint has his or her relics there, and then you would have a village essentially grow around that abbey or around that church. Point is, you had it in the middle, and you wanted it as close to the church as you could. If you were wealthy, if you were an aristocrat, you were inside the church itself. Okay? After that, you were outside of a church in a church yard. Paris, I mentioned, grew very quickly. Because of its geography, it grew very quickly, where after the fall of the Roman Empire, the first two cities to get to 1 million people were London and Paris. The problem is you had all of these cemeteries right in the middle, and then city grew up around it so quickly that the cemeteries themselves couldn't expand. And we'll focus on one cemetery in particular, called the Cemetery of the Innocents. The Cimetière des Innocents, or the Holy Innocents. Have any of you been to an area, it's called Châtelet or Léal? L-E-S-H-A-L-L-E-S. Yeah? It's the very middle of the city. It is the world's biggest underground train station. If you can avoid it, underground, avoid it. It's called Léal because that's where we used to have the markets, which we'll figure into the story in a little bit. So there, in the middle, we had the Cemetery of the Innocents. Okay? This was the most popular cemetery in Paris for the simple reason it was the cheapest cemetery in Paris. Okay, so all of the poor and the vast majority of the commoners were buried in this little plot. That started in the 8th century. By the time you get to the 12th century, this cemetery is full, but the city has grown all around that. You have buildings around it, you have other churches around it, you have proto-restaurants that didn't quite exist yet, but essentially inns and taverns that were around it, and it couldn't expand anymore. So by the time we get to the 14th century, burial in this city, particularly in this cemetery, is essentially a farce. Okay, you would come into the yard, you would see your loved one in a casket, you'd have this ceremony. As soon as you walked out of the yard, a trap door opened under it, and your loved one would go into a mass grave. Because what they had done, this cemetery was roughly square in size. They would build a trench on one edge of it, inside edge of it, fill that up with bodies. Then they would pour quicklime on it. Why quicklime?
Dissolves.
Very good. Dissolves the flesh. Okay? In their kind of pre-scientific method way of thought, they just thought all that flesh just disappeared into nothing. All right? Cover that up. Trench number 2, fill, lime, cover up. Number 3, same thing. Number 4, get back to the first one, uncover it. That lime has done its work for the most part. So some flesh on it, which we fed to our lovely rats. After the rats had gone done with it, we picked up the bones and we stacked them on the side of the cemetery. We did that for almost 800 years in this one cemetery. Over and over and over again.
Above ground?
Huh?
Above ground?
The ground itself changed.
Oh.
You build on top,
Okay.
on top, and on top.
And people were aware, right, that their loved ones were just,
Eventually, people became aware that they were.
Eventually.
But the important thing for them is that they were blessed. The blessing ceremony happened. Okay. Now, what eventually starts happening? Now we know that flesh just doesn't disappear.
water system.
We know now about, bacteria and viruses and all these lovely little things. And that seeped into the ground. And what do we have all around? We have taverns, we have inns, we have homes, we have these businesses. The situation in the center of Paris was absolutely unbearable. Okay? The businesses started protesting almost from the beginning that this was going on. Okay? But in the strata of medieval French society, all right, you have the church and you have the aristocracy on top. Then in the middle you have what are called the guilds. Okay? Now the guilds are financially very important, but they have no political voice. So they keep complaining, but the church is making a heck of a lot of money on these burials, and they're not doing anything about it. Eventually they pretend to take certain steps. They say, well, all right, we get it. We'll increase the price of burials to discourage people. Discourage them from what? From dying? Then they're like, okay, yeah, we understand. The smell is pretty strong. So then in the 14th century, like, we'll put a market next to that. That smell will cover up everything else. So now you have Paris's biggest source of food next to the biggest burial ground. So you can imagine what that did with pandemics and epidemics, disease here in the city of Paris.
How many years ago?
This was starting in the 12th century, accelerating in the 14th.
Did it contaminate the water sources?
We don't have a central water system, but it did eventually seep into the center. Yes. As legend would have it, this water is now saturated with all that's been dissolved. Okay. Most of these homes, the foundations are wood. So the legend of how you can go down into one of these basements of one of these taverns, one of these inns, and you can get your hand, scrape it up the wall, and end up with a tennis ball sized clump of human goo.
Wow.
Okay. One thing that we have now that we didn't have before is we have not free press, but we have press. Okay? And so stories start coming out like this, and the pressure starts building, and kind of the last straw that broke this camel's back was probably, we now know, some fake news, but some effective fake news. It was the story of a young girl, the daughter of an innkeeper, whose place abutted this cemetery. She was sent down to fetch some wine. When she gets down there, she goes missing for about half an hour. Her father comes down to get her, and she's buried under a pile of corpses because the wall went up against one of these trenches and it collapsed onto her. And that is it becomes scandalous in the city of Paris. Figures from the Enlightenment, the Voltaires, the Diderot will start writing about this. And finally, it pushes the king, again, Louis XVI, to say, all right, this is enough. They shut down all burials inside of Paris. And once you die, you have to get buried in a cemetery outside of the city limits. He orders the construction of 4 new cemeteries that are well outside of Paris at the time. The most famous one is what is now inside Paris, Père Lachaise. But now what do we do with all these bones? What did I say was going on at the same time, right? The reinforcement of all of these tunnels. The chief engineer at the time is the one that proposes, in much more elegant terms than I'm allowed to put it. Hey, king, you've got these bones. I've got these tunnels. Just put them in here. And it's a brilliant and simple idea. One problem, though, is one of you mentioned, the families. These are all consecrated bones. You cannot disturb this. But the situation is so grave, pardon the pun, unintended pun, really unintended pun, that I caught myself saying, that they push ahead anyway. Okay, so they start ordering the transferring of these bones, about 1784, first starting from the cemetery of the Innocence. And each night, to kind of keep the religious respect for this, each night they're brought down what is now the Boulevard Saint-Michel, through the gate where that lion was upstairs, and down into those shafts that we saw where these bricks would go through. That one cemetery took almost 3 years to empty. And they were doing this every single night.
Did the loved ones know that?
They couldn't, if they knew that their loved one was buried there, yes. Now they could not possibly identify the individual remains.
There was no protest or anything?
Well, what they did to prevent it is that they would have they would have it at night. so they would do it discreetly. And two, the actual procession would be accompanied by monks and priests, and they would be chanting and praying all the way down with the incense, swinging the incense back and forth to kind of maintain the sacrosanctness of the remains. But once they got here, they just dumped them in the hole. They didn't get to the way we see them now until a little bit later. Any questions so far? Any other questions?
The thing with the little girl is strictly just a rumor.
We were fairly sure it was not true.
Kind of cool, so
Smart
it's not
rumor.
real.
We're fairly sure it was not. But again, this matters all the way once we get to the French Revolution, right? These guilds, these what we would not call the closest thing we would have to they would have to a middle class. These were people with very serious economic power, but zero political power. Okay, and it's by 1789, that broke. All right, the French Revolution in the beginning was not a revolution of the peasants; it was a revolution of the middle class, of people with money, businesses, but no political authority. It worked because then later the peasants joined, but it took years for the peasants to join. Eventually, the rest of society joined, but it was these people who had gotten themselves a decent life, combined with the fact that you have all of these thoughts coming in, the same sort of thinkers and writers that are influencing the revolutionaries in the US. Remember, most of them are French, right? The Montesquieus, the Diderots, the Rousseaus, the Voltaires, that influenced the Jeffersons, and the Adamses and the Franklins. They're French. So it's not like they weren't influencing people here too. So eventually that system broke, the middle class rose up, the peasants realized, hey, it's pretty crap for us too. And the revolution succeeded.
Did the bones do anything to reinforce the tunnels or stop collapses?
No. In fact, the busiest thing they do now is reinforcing the bones and keeping the bones up and from not falling down. On our way up, I'm going to take this ramp. So this is the ramp where Thomas de Cure died. You see there's two different layers. We're going to back up to another. This is where he was trying to dig his entrance. Okay? And also just a quick little tip. Once we get up to the very top up there, look back, and it makes for a pretty cool picture. Okay. All right. Let's go back.
So he was building this?
Not quite this. This was put in later to join these two levels.
I see.
And if you're done with that, then just come right here.
What do you think of it?
Oh, it's so cool.
Yeah.
Learning so much.
We had in France at the time something called the Estates General, okay, which was the closest thing you'd get to what we now is called the National Assembly and a legislative assembly. The Estates General was broken up into three different estates. The first estate was the nobility. The second estate was the aristocracy. The third estate was the bourgeoisie, these business owners, not quite commoners. You still had to be white and male and in most cases have a business or be part of the guild, but about the closest thing you're going to get to the common person getting represented. Now, in sheer numbers, that third estate vastly outnumbered the other two by like 5 to 1. But the problem is the rules of voting wasn't one person, one representative, one vote. It was one estate, one vote. So the first estate had one vote. The second estate had one vote. The third estate, even though they outnumbered them 5 to 1, only had one vote. The Estates General was only ever called up when the king needed to raise money, basically when he needed taxes. When somebody, for example, somebody from the third estate would propose taxing the nobility or the church, those two would vote no, only the third estate would vote yes. When they would propose taxing again that third estate, those two would vote yes. And that was at the end, because you can't separate what happened from its context. We also had an environmental issue at that time. We had, for 2 years in a row, we had crop failures in France. We had inflation because of those crop failures. The price of bread had more than quadrupled. The women's march to Versailles that dragged the king and queen back to Paris, there were people complaining about the price of flour. They were carrying day-old baguette, which is a very dangerous weapon if you've had a day-old baguette. All right, so this is not, what was unusual about this revolution is that it worked. But the reasons it happened were things we've seen throughout history. Okay, a lack of representation, out of control prices, people not being able to meet their basic needs. So we have this French Revolution. These bones are just dumped into these shafts. Okay, the only order they're kept in is from the cemetery they came from. They're not kept in any other kind of order. They're just literally piles of bones. We have the revolution. The 19th century France we'll go with complicated. There are about 4 different revolutions that happened in the 19th century. But essentially, after that initial French Revolution, we have that 1 year of, it's called the Terror. Then the ones that take over is called the Consulate. Okay, and it's ruled by a committee of 3. Unfortunately, for the other 2, in that 3, one of those 3 was a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. So 3 turned into 1 within a few years. He becomes first consul. Now, through all of this, right, through the revolution, through the consulate, through the empire of Napoleon, the work still continues in bringing the bones down here, because even though most royal projects were stopped, remember, this was something that the bourgeoisie wanted. So this actually continued throughout. The bones will continue coming here. Napoleon comes into power. When Napoleon comes into power, finally makes himself emperor in 1804, on his first council, he brings Christianity back into France. Now, we don't believe was personally very religious, but one, his family was, his mother especially, Laetitia was, and he also understood the political power of having the church on his side. Okay, so now the government is once again Christian. Head engineer here, a man named Eric de Thury, is a good Catholic man. He comes in here and he sees all these good Catholic French people just in piles, and he's aghast. He's like, what are we doing? These people who were given proper Catholic burials, they need to be treated with respect. So he's the one who starts putting them in the way we now see them. That is sort of organized. There are tributes to them. There are messages all around. He's the one that essentially decorates this the way we find it here. Now, what else is going on? Napoleon at this time, just like the English, is having a great time running around Egypt and Northern Africa, taking everything they can get. So anything Egyptian is the mode, right? It is the fashion. So that's why we see things like the obelisk and things like that all around. Okay, it's also the beginning of what we call Romanticism. Okay, Romanticism is not just about love, but essentially is more about individual emotional truths. So we have citations from Shakespeare, from Dante, all of that pretty much saying on the same theme, carpe diem. There's one citation which I personally love. We should be able to see it because the route changes. The sentence says, "Where is death? If you remember that it is always in front of you, it will soon be behind you." Once you accept that your time here is limited, you're actually much more free. That is the theme pretty much throughout with all of these citations. And that is what he wanted to remind people, on top of paying proper homage to the ancestors. Halt, here lies the empire. Very lovely. We'll go into the antechamber. Now, this line up here. Was a tribute to death, was a tribute to them as well. Also, one quick tip, once we get in there, I know your first instinct is going to be to click, 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 and take all these pictures. Trust me, and hold on. One, we don't want to block the entrance, and 2, there's going to be a couple of places, including, again, one that is just for us. So we're going to get a lot better photos than here at the entrance. All right? Before we go in, some Latin, Memoriae Majorum. Again, this was part of those remembrances, essentially a memorial of those above, or essentially those before. Let's go, and remember to keep your bags in front. Bags in front, and no head.
What's your head?
Okay, I'm up to around here. Just want to make sure everybody's through.
They glued or cemented in place?
Okay, so the question, guys, for on the back, you're going to come right about to here. And hold on right to here and just stay right there. Just obviously careful with the bones. And you can stop right there where you are. And just careful with the bones there. So the question was if they are glued or cemented in any way. No, they're not. In a couple of spaces, they've tried to do that every once in a while. But for almost all of this is really just the stacking up of these bones. Specifically, what we see are tibias. Okay, these are the leg bones. Longest bones, and to be a bit crude about it, the most stackable. Okay, so the bones we see, the only order is those leg bones. Everything else is actually just thrown in the back. Okay, and it is that wall of tibia that holds everything back. The skulls have no structural value, they're purely decorative. Okay? And I want to show you a couple of things to show that it is not held back. So if we turn back and we see these first ones that we came in through, you see how they're nice and straight, right? Yet we see the ones behind you now, right here, they're bulging out. Okay? That is essentially because the ones that are nice and straight have more recently collapsed and been restacked. While these haven't in a long time.
How far back does this go?
It changes anything from a couple of meters to about 30 meters in some cases. Okay. Also, before we continue through, I want to show you guys at the very top in Latin. It says, "Quacumque videris sequitur cor mors copris umbra." Whomever enters this place, death will follow like a shadow. I've cursed you all. All right, let's keep going, guys. We're not going to stop here so much, but you'll see as we come in here at the corner, you see how that is stacked up. Essentially, they're just perpendicular to each other. That's how all it's a little, well, I mean, it's skeletal Jenga, I guess.
Probably been restacked?
Yeah, so this was actually on 12 years ago. This one in particular was restacked.
All leftovers are just going back to them.
Watch your head.
We'll talk about what that is in just a second, so I'll make it out to this here. The most general estimates are anywhere, usually 6 million is the figure given. I've seen as high as 10, but I don't quite believe that. But 6 million. From that one cemetery, the Cemetery of the Innocence, we have approximately 2 million. From just that one. Alright? Everyone in my group is here. All right, so we're going to give another lovely bonjour to this gentleman here. Thank you, because he's going to open this section just for us as well. And I'll tell you what that was there in a minute. Guys, come in through here. And we'll move a little bit forward so everybody's there. And they're just going to be, I did see one of my colleagues behind us, so she might join us a little bit. She's got a small group. But it'll just be us. Maxi. So the estimate is 6 million. 2 million from that one cemetery of the Innocence. That area we were just in now also served very similar to, remember that well-looking area beforehand? It was also one of those foot baths. It was also a place where the workers could essentially wash before going back outside. We continue to here. We're going to go towards the end. I'm going to show you something around this end here. This is actually both the oldest and newest section. Oldest because you'll start seeing things like here. I'll show you guys again later on when we're all together, don't worry. It says ossements or remains of the Cemetery of the Innocents placed here in 1786. These are the oldest bones. These are the first bones put in here in this system. Okay. The reason I said these were the newer ones, you'll see these columns look fairly modern, because they are. So this was the area that was reinforced in 2004. You all heard, I think a couple times, the metro rolling through, okay? That's relatively new. So for those works, they knew they had to reinforce this area here. So this is the part they reinforced, because during some of those works, they did collapse, and they put them back out. An altar, very good. This was an altar. all the way until the 1970s, at least once a year, actually just once a year, there was a Catholic Mass service that was held here on November 1st, All Saints Day. Okay? If you were Parisian for more than, 6-7 generations, chances are you had somebody, one of your ancestors who's down here. Going every November 1st up all the way up to 1973 is when they stopped. They had a mass down here. Sorry, I mentioned that the only real organization is the cemeteries, right? But so there's no identifying really any individual remains anymore. We do know some people that we're very sure are down here, okay? We know that the head of the terror during the revolution, Robespierre, is actually down here, okay? He's one of the latest people who was put down here. After he was executed, after he was guillotined, his remains were put into the catacombs. We know that the man in the iron mask, yes, was a real person, probably not the brother of the king, but there was a prisoner kept in an iron mask in a jail in Marseille. Was a real person that there's no debate about, is in here. His remains, we have records of it being transferred to a Parisian cemetery that then was emptied into the catacomb system as well. The oldest bones here, okay, this same thing as the other plaque which said ossements, which means the remains of the cemetery of the Innocents, left here in April 1786. So these were the first bones moved in here. I'll also give you guys a couple minutes. If you see in front of me behind you guys, these are the only fully intact crosses in the system. So this is where you'll want to take those photos. You can see some other bones which are already old.
I'm going on this side. I'm going on this side.
Oh, I did.
Oh, my video. My video.
You guys want to get one together? Oh,
Just 2 years ago, a few years, 2019, there was a story in the French press. A wine collector got about 150,000 euros worth about 200,000 euros worth of wine stolen. He lives in the 5th arrondissement. His basement goes up against one of these tunnels. Somebody figured it out, went into that basement and started stealing his collection of old Bordeaux vintage wine. Okay? There are plays put on down here. What do you think is the most common play produced here? Close? Hamlet. The skulls. Got plenty of props down here for the skulls.
Like legally?
No, not legally.
Oh, they come
not
down
legally.
and
Not legally. No.
do play.
Yes. So there are parties where if you come to a party here, you'll go in about 10, 11 p.m. And you wade through nothing like sewer water, but essentially very sort of hard water that the pants you never want to wear again. And there are parties down here, okay? There are poetry readings, there are concerts, and then you're led back out like 6, 7 in the morning the next day. I would not come down here by myself. I'm comfortable in this area. I've been here, but I would get totally lost. So it's people whom I know it well that allow it.
If they do this illegally underground, how many Parisians end up with skulls on their mantles at home?
On their mantle, probably a few. So this area here, it's called the lamp of the Sepulchral. This used to be a lamp that was here. Why would you have a flame down here?
to see.
Huh? To see, and then something else. What did I say was air? Air. It have two purposes. One, but not quite as important. You kept air moving, but also it served as a bit of a canary. If there's not enough oxygen for this flame, there's not enough oxygen for you. All right, get out. Take that emergency exit. All right, but the real reason, the real nerdy reason I love this spot. If you look up, you're on my 342nd tour now. You see the stalactites now just starting to form on the ceilings. Okay, so if you come back from my 12,000th tour, there might be down here by then. But you see, remember I told you guys to take photos of that cross because most of those crosses, this is what's become of them. There, okay? People with their book bags, people just being kids, being dumb. When I say kids, adults being kids. And so a couple of these areas have been walled off for only guides. They're protected. All right? let's move down here. We've got my favorite story before we leave this little part of the system. Careful, I think it's slippery in this area, so please watch your steps. Are any of you staying in Airbnb? Yes? Alright, cool. So, Airbnb made its way to Paris in 2015. They wanted to make a big splash. So they held a contest, a writing contest. And those, whomever won the contest, got the chance for themselves and a +1 to spend one night here at the catacombs. Guess which night? Halloween, October 31st. Alright? So this contest was won by a young Brazilian gentleman in his mid-20s. So he came over here with his +1. So, okay, first of all, guess his +1. His mom. And they had a setup in this very spot we're in now. Okay? So his bed, their bed, was right in here. They had some lovely fake candles growing around. Some lovely music playing. Saint-Saëns, Dance Macabre. All to sort of set the proper mood. At 11 p.m., lights out. When I say lights out, I mean lights out.
Lights.
And all they had was a radio. Okay. By coincidence, I think you guys saw him upstairs, was the one who let us in. He was actually the one on duty that night. And as he tells it, by about 1 in the morning, he starts getting clicks on the radio, and they're done. Like, no. He has to come down here, waking up from his nap. Apparently, she was totally great to stay here for the rest of the time. He's the one who couldn't handle it much anymore. By the way, you can still do that. You can privatize it. If you're looking for a space for your next corporate event, you can rent out the catacombs for an evening and even for a night. Okay?
Oh my lord.
I will say, not the creepiest Airbnb I've seen in Paris. I've seen some really interesting ones. But yes, if you have a spare, I think it was about 120,000 euros that Airbnb shelled out at the time, you too can advertise and spend the night here in the catacombs.
Big no for me.
All right, let's
It's a big no.
All right, folks, we're gonna rejoin the commoners. All right, we're gonna make our way this way.
Did they ever do DNA testing just to see if what part of the world that they were from? Like, do they have Roman heritage? Like, did they have that amount of history around
From what I understand, a very good question. I actually don't think they have. All right, gonna keep going this way.
None of these bones ever just fall?
Yes, the bones on occasion will just fall, and you can imagine how frightening that is. Every once in a while, when the guards want to play a joke on me, if they know I'm the first one, they will put like a line of skulls down in the middle. So I turn a corner, and I'm the face. You see a couple of you. So on my right now, remember I mentioned that they are beyond that first wall of tibia, and fibulus. They are just stacked up behind that. Okay, and they do collapse on occasion. Now, it is French. They take a while to stack them back up. This one collapsed a whole 2 years ago. They still haven't restacked it. So we used to go around that way. Alright, so what we're going to do is occupy this space a little bit, everyone. And just go up until that second column right there. Yeah, and then we're going to look back this way. Okay? And just if you're facing, even if you have your back, just be careful with the bones behind you. And we're going to make a sort of roll up two, but don't go further than that because we're going to look back at this guy. So a lot of these kind of plaques and memorials we've seen, most of these are for the churches they came from. This one's a little bit different, okay? So we're going to take this a couple of times. So DM, les ossements, so remember that means the remains, OS, like osteoporosis, stuff like that, means bones, the remains of the Church of St. Lawrence, deposited here the 17th of April, and that in Roman numerals is 1871. Well, first of all, let's go back to what happens in 1870. The head of France is that same Emperor Napoleon III. I think Napoleon III always had a bit of a chip on his shoulder when it came to his uncle, and sort of the glory of his uncle. Now, Napoleon III did a lot of things for Paris and the infrastructure of France in general, but he was not the military man his uncle was. Just on the other side of the Rhine River is one of the great statesmen of the 19th century, a man named Otto von Bismarck, who is the chancellor, essentially the prime minister of what is the rising power in Europe, Prussia. Germany, like Italy, doesn't exist yet. Okay, there are German states, but they are independent states. Okay, the biggest being Prussia, Austria, and Bavaria. Okay, historically the most powerful one was Austria, but for the previous 100 or so years you have the rise of the Prussians. And Bismarck wants to do two things. He wants to solidify Prussian position on top, and he wants to unify all these German states into one German nation, obviously with Prussia and Berlin leading that path. Okay, he knows one thing that could do that would be a war, particularly with a country that is supposed to be the strongest, best armed country in Western Europe, France. But he's also a very good politician, and he understands that a lot of these German states won't join him if he's seen as the aggressor. It's got to be a defensive war. So starting really in the mid-1860s, he starts playing the Russians, he starts playing particularly the French, and goading Napoleon into a war. He starts releasing sort of these leaks that are completely fake about the way the French are treating the Prussians. They start releasing news about the French ambassador being treated in a disrespectful manner in the Prussian court. They start sort of building up this sense of rivalry between France and Prussia. And then finally, to defend sort of the honor of France, and I happen to think to show that he's a proper Bonaparte, Napoleon III declares war on Prussia. And we have what we now call the Franco-Prussian War. Great, best equipped, best trained army in Western Europe gets wiped out on the battlefield. Okay, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte himself taken prisoner at the Battle of Sedan. Most of the public didn't want this war. So when the Prussians tried to ransom him back, they're like, no, that's all right, you can keep him. Don't worry about it. There is honor at stake now. And this now provisional government and these people keep fighting the war. The war keeps going very badly for them. In 1870, by the end of 1870, the Prussians have surrounded Paris and are laying siege to Paris. The winter of 1870-1871 is probably the worst in recorded history in France, in Paris. We have the coldest winter we've recorded in Paris. We have the biggest flood of the Seine we've ever recorded in Paris. And we have the siege of Paris. Things got so bad, we actually started eating the zoo animals. If you look at Christmas menus, you have, if you were a commoner, you have fricassee of souris, of mouse. If you're better off, you have elephant steak. Okay, they didn't let us have a zoo again for like 100 years. Eventually, the new provisional government in France surrenders. Parisians are not happy. They're like, we did not just go through that for you to surrender. They actually rise up. The Parisian National Guard, which was originally founded by Lafayette about 100 years earlier, rises up, rebels against the new government, and creates a new system of government that we now know as the Commune, which was known as the Commune back then. It's a very controversial government, even now. Commune is very much related to that word, communist. All right? This was a proto-communist, a proto-Marxist state. To their credit, they did a lot of things that we would now consider pretty basic, right? Universal suffrage, women were given the vote, separation of church and state, the abolition of capital punishment. However, just like a lot of things related to that word, they also had a way of making you disappear if you didn't believe in some of those amazing new if you didn't believe in some of those amazing progressive ideas that they had. Okay? And so starting in April 1871, this new government under the head of a man named Adolphe Thiers, starts retaking their capital. Okay, and it culminates in a week we call La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week. And there are fights throughout Paris. They start in the south and the east because they start from Versailles and start fighting their way street by street across Paris. That fighting takes place literally where we're standing now. Standing now, there was a battle between the Fédérés, or the Communards, as they were called, and the new soldiers of the army of Versailles. Eventually, the Fédérés lose. It takes about a week. The last battle, ironically, this was one of the first battles. The last battle was actually in Père Lachaise Cemetery, and all of these bones collapsed. Many of them were destroyed, and so after the war, we have this new government. That's a fairly conservative government, and they put up this plaque. But you would have noticed that this plaque has been adapted. Okay, it says deposited. We see there's a V and there's an S there because it used to say something before that. It used to say the remains, because it's used to the holy remains, the remains of the Church of St. Lawrence, violés par les fédérés, violated, desecrated by the Communards. 17 April 1871. The Commune is something we still fight over to this day. Okay, when we have a conservative mayor of Paris, we talk about the villainy of the Commune, and we mourn their massacres. When we have a left-wing mayor, as we do now, and the anniversary was just a few years ago, we have celebrations of the glory of the Commune. We still fight about that to this day. About 30 years ago, to let a more neutral tone to this, they put in the more neutral deposited here, but they left the V and the S. So you would remember there was something there before that. During the Second World War, there were no battles here that we know of, but these tunnels were used by the resistance as storage for weapons cache and for planning. The Germans knew that was happening, but those resistance fighters were actually students from that École de Mines, from the engineering school. And like I've said, those students know these tunnels better than everybody. So the Germans never found where the resistance base was. When was the last? Very good. I'm going to see what we're brought together. And I'll, do you know the answer? Just curious. But okay, cool.
Because I don't think it was that long ago.
Okay. Just get to a little spot where we're all together.
Yeah, if you want. And the rest of them made it up. And they were just in there.
Come into this other one here. Perfect timing for that question. I don't know if we stop here, but that's a perfect time for that question in this little spot. Okay. Alright, come in guys. The question is, when was the last time the guillotine was used in France? The answer is 1973.
I was going to think 76. Yeah, close.
Alright. So, the French abolished the death penalty in the 80s, but the last person actually executed was a man in the south of France in 1973, and the official execution method was still the guillotine. Okay. The only difference is that, unlike in the Revolution, it was not done publicly. Now, many of the bones here, particularly the bones behind me, are people who were guillotined. Now, the next part I'm going to say, I will fully admit, officially, the state disagrees with me. I remain unconvinced. It is my belief that in this area is actually where we can find Marie Antoinette. Now I'll explain why, and why they say I'm wrong, to be fair. Okay? So, what this is the cemetery of the Madeleine. Okay? That Madeleine church, that Greco-Roman, looks like a Greco-Roman temple near Concorde, is a church. Remember, Place de la Concorde was one of the two main spots for guillotining, Bastille and the Concorde. And this was a spot where both the king and Marie Antoinette were guillotined. At the time, the entire purpose was that they were to be treated as any other citizens. So first of all, it's not as if they were wearing any royal regalia. She was in a white shroud like everyone else that was guillotined. Her head was trimmed and shaved like everyone else that would have been guillotined. And like everyone else that was guillotined, she was put into an unmarked mass grave. We know that was in the Madeleine Cemetery. That's where most of the ones from the Concorde guillotine were put into. After Napoleon falls in 1815, we have something called the Restoration, the Bourbon Restoration. We actually have the kings back from 1815 until 1848, okay? And to them, and to royalists now, the biggest sin in French history is not just the revolution, but in particular, the guillotining of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, okay? So they go trying to find the remains of Marie Antoinette. What they actually do, this part I am not making up, is they go to the Madeleine Cemetery, they bring someone who was a close servant of Marie Antoinette, and they task him with finding these bones. And amongst all these bones, he decides, I think that's her.
Of just bones? He was just looking through bones?
Just bones?
They were all wearing the same thing. There was no royal regalia. There was nothing, she wouldn't wear anything that would mark her. So
how long had she been down there when he sent her down to
this
look?
was 1818. She'd been down there since 1792.
Jeez.
Okay? So it is possible he was right. And those are now in Saint Denis Basilica, which is a traditional burial ground of the kings and queens of France. But I think it is more likely that he misidentified her and that she is with the rest of the bones of the Madeleine, which are here. That would be it.
What leads them to believe he was correct to the point that they still stick with that story?
To the point they still stick to that story, they used a lot of the closest thing we get to forensic at the time, which was kind of sketches of her sort of jaw structure, bone structure. We do have royal DNA. Now the thing is, she's not in direct line of royalty. So although we in theory could prove whether Louis XVI is there, it'd be more difficult to prove. Unless we find sort of DNA of the Habsburg line, where she's from.
And the
Which we could, by the way. Like, there are Habsburgs, like, around.
And the bones were all kept together, so almost certainly there are bones here.
Yes. So almost certainly there are bones here. Now there was, for example, there was a man who also this crazy man who, through the 20th century, walked around with what he said was the head of King Henry IV in a box. We tested it. Turned out he did have the head of the head. So we have the royal DNA. It was the head of Henry IV.
Wow.
So these things are provable and disprovable. All right. So again, I could be completely wrong. Maybe I'm just a complotist, as we say, a conspiracy theorist. Maybe it's possible I could be wrong, but you can prove me wrong. All right. Let's go this way. But yeah, that guillotine, which by the way was originally seen as the humane way to kill somebody. Okay. Right? That guillotine, before the guillotine, you were most likely hanged, drawn and quartered, and if you were decapitated, it would have been by a man swinging an axe.
Ooh.
He might have missed. He might have not gotten through the first time. So the guillotine was once seen as a humane way to do it, because it was fairly quick. Remember that it's angled, that guillotine, so it kind of slices through. And also it was seen as the sort of égalité, this egalitarian way, because everybody got killed the same way. Because if you were a noble who was going to get killed before that, you could pay for the best reputed, axeman in Paris to take care of it for you.
And all these bodies, they're not necessarily the same. They're all spread out.
They're all spread out, yeah. Okay, watch, as we turn to the right, watch your heads, some of you.
It's a little tight down here.
Alright, folks, I've kept you here much longer than I should have. We're almost done. Just to round off that Marie Antoinette thing, we are a little bit more sure that they might have gotten the skull right, okay? Because I remember we have the sketches, we have the bone structure. Also, right after she died, they made what's called a death mask, okay, where they hired, so there was a woman, and they hired her to essentially make a wax model of her head right after she died. The woman's name is
it the wax?
Madame Tussaud.
Yes.
This is how Madame Tussaud got her start. She was making death masks of guillotine victims. Okay, and then she was exiled to the UK, to what's now UK. So that's the skull there, pretty sure. But I'm very sure there's a substantial amount of bones of Marie Antoinette that are in here. Now, we have kind of 1.5 more spots before I dismiss the class. Back upstairs. So this used to be the exit all the way up until 2014, 2015. But using that exit violated a very important international law, which is that there was no room for a gift shop. So they built a whole new exit, which we're going to take, on top of which has a lovely gift shop. More importantly, has some toilets up there as well. I will say it's a very nice gift shop. To be fair, it's a cool gift shop. If you want to buy something. Yes, sir.
Is this covered in plastic because it's getting ready to fall?
It's getting ready to fall. Yeah, right. So we're going over this way. This has only been covered for about 1.5 years. All right, so yeah, it's getting. They're worried about this one here.
So they try to catch it before it happens.
Yeah, they do that. What we do here, for you see something. I like showing you this here before our last little spot. I want to give you all, and we'll do this, a couple of you at a time. I've talked about how it's, estimated 6 million people down here, but it is, 6 million of our ancestors. It is a place we have to keep respect. I want to give you all an idea what almost 1,000 years of life and death looks like, and see how deep this guy goes. Wow.
How deep it goes, I think.
It's like 80 feet, maybe?
We'll see once we're
Yeah, here, babe, if you come here. Here, I'll move.
Oh my god.
You're so tiny.
That's the one that's about 25, almost 30 meters.
That is wild. And these would have been the areas where they did all of their masonry work.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Let's go over here this way. It's a little bit higher ceiling, so I can set up straight. Him, known officially as the barrel, but of course, us guys are a classier bunch. We call it the keg. So I want to bring you back. We saw that line that goes above, right? And was with us for most of the tour. From the very beginning, the general public was interested in coming down here. Okay, just as you all were curious about coming down here, people were back then as well. But it was not allowed. Most people were not allowed here, but of course, the people still did. Usually, former aristocrats and nobles and the wealthy would come down here. The average person wasn't allowed to come down here. So what happens in 1898? Let's say we're all sort of members of Parisian high society back then, right? And we get an invitation to a party that says, come dressed to the nines, all sort of the proper formal wear. Gives you the address where to come in, and it has this odd instruction as well that says, but don't come to the main address, come, sort of about a couple hundred meters away, and then walk over to the main address. They don't want to draw attention. Okay, so when you come to the main door, knock on the door, you're greeted by your hands of God, and he brings you down with a torch all the way down to actually this area. Now, what do we find? The barrel's not here, okay, but the column, you see there's a column running through the middle.
Yes.
And that was 25, 30 meters of bones were moved to there afterwards, okay? What they find down here is a full symphony orchestra.
Wow.
And these people are treated to an evening-long concert of that brand new hip composer Chopin that was going around making his romantic music. They went through a lot of effort to try to kind of keep this discreet. Do you think that worked? No. Remember, we have the ancien regime, the old regime is gone, right? There is now mass media, there are now rights, there is now free press. The very next day there are engravings, there are sketches of what that party looked like. And the public is like, hey, you keep saying that nobody can come down here. It is unsafe or it is sacred. You keep coming up with these excuses and you're partying down there. So finally, that is what built the pressure to open this up at first just once a week. They put in that line for people to come in, right? Eventually, after the Second World War, it goes to about 4 times a week. By the time we get to the early 2000s, 6 days a week. So it is thanks to those ridiculous and effete Parisian high society members that you're able to join me on my 342nd tour. Thank you. Enjoyed it. What we're going to do, we're going to make our way out. About halfway through that tunnel, guys, you're going to look up, you'll see it. And that was actually the original shaft that bones were tossed down. The top of that shaft, if you want to see it, is in the gift shop next to the refrigerator. Next to, so once we go, you'll see the top of that.
The other catacombs that you've visited, are they as organized as this?
No, these are really the only ones.
Yeah.
So this covers the bones. The ossuary is only about 900 meters that we go through. The other sections do have bones as well. And they were originally organized in the same way, but they haven't been kept up.
Yeah.
Watch your head, babe.
And right up there to the gift shop, you want to do a quick.
Oh, dang.
Darn it, I didn't get it.
That's a tough picture to take, right?
Yeah.
All right, everyone ready?
Oh, yeah.
Go at our own pace. It's the one healthy thing I do in my life. It's these stairs.
I hear you.
Ça va. Bon, il n'est pas rigolé ton bouton. Merci.
Non, allez-y, allez-y.
Merci.
Alright guys, go around. I'm gonna stick around for a few more minutes. If any of you need to know kind of where you're heading, how to get to wherever you need to head, just let me know.
What Perfect. Remember. I know, great.
Highest one I heard you saw was 127, right? Highest is actually 165.
Oh, I didn't see that number.
165.
Ah, darn it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You get it right at the end, guys. All right, that's what matters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
The gift shop now.
Okay.
You want something here?
Let me look. Yeah, come here. I'll get you one. Here, get some. Figure out how to sew it on.
This is it.
This is not it. This can't be it.
This is the last night in Paris.
For now.
We did the catacombs.
It was so nice.
Yeah. It took 3 hours. It took like double the time, right?
I guess the times here for people aren't real.
We just had dinner, had a dessert, and now we're gonna wait for the light show in 11 minutes. And the light show stays on for like 5 minutes.
So we gotta be quick with all of our poses.
And that long flight home.
And then we come back someday.
Yeah. So.
You have to come back with me
Yeah.
before we die.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll make it out here.
I touched one of the skulls and I went like this because I was nervous. I was like, I don't want to cast a curse on me.
There she goes. There she goes.
Thank you
Yeah.
for such a magical trip. I love you so much. You're my little honey bunny.
Peace out, Paris. Appreciate y'all watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see ya in the next adventure.
See ya. Where should we go next?
Yeah, comment down below. Peace.